Hey listeners, we've got a superb episode for you today where we'll be speaking to one of our philosophy lecturers, Professor Emma Borg, about two hugely important aspects of human life and society. Firstly, Emma's going to be talking about her work into the best way we can help people suffering from chronic pain. And then she's going to be speaking about her research into how we can ensure that big businesses play a positive role in society. Enjoy. A very warm welcome to you, Emma, to this podcast episode. And we'll just kick things off by asking you to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what you do.
Great, thanks very much. I'm delighted to be here too. So my name is Emma Borg. I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Reading. I'm also director of something called the Reading Centre for Cognition Research, which is an interdisciplinary unit primarily involving philosophers and psychologists, but also historians and people in politics and a really broad range of people, all of whom are interested in trying to understand the human mind and human thinking. So those are my main roles, but then I'm also an independent advisor to Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs Professional Standards Committee, which is an additional kind of role I have. And I think I'm right in saying that I'm the only philosopher that's employed by HMRC. So I kind of like to make that point.
It's really, really fascinating stuff. And the one thing which we noticed your specialism in pain, Emma. And so a bit of a broad question, a layman's question, if you want. But what is pain? What are all the various definitions for it?
Well, that is a fantastic question to start with, and a very broad question. And you would think that by now I would have a good answer to that question. But in fact, it's pretty difficult to answer easily. And I think that's a reflection of the fact that pain is actually a very complex phenomenon. And I think the answer you get to the question of what is pain will probably depend on exactly who you're asking. You'll probably get different answers from philosophers, from psychologists, from neuroscientists. And I think that reflects the idea that pain has these different kind of dimensions to it. So I think one answer we might give that's been popular in philosophy and also in neuroscience is to say that pain is just a certain kind of brain state. It's when your brain is in certain kinds of patterns of activation. That is what it is to be in pain. But one issue we might have with that is that it's not obvious that that's a satisfactory definition of what pain is, because we might want to allow that people can be in pain, but not be in that kind of brain state. And interestingly enough, we find that in contemporary work in psychology and neuroscience, we find patients who display all the symptoms of being in pain, but then when you put them in a scanner, you find that unfortunately they've suffered serious amounts of brain damage, and they're just missing the areas of the brain that are known to be associated through the pain matrix. And then we face the question of, well, do you want to say those patients are in pain, or do you want to say they can't be in pain because they don't have the right brain states? And in general, I think our intuition is that we want to be able to say that they're in pain, even though they don't have the same physical underpinnings. And that leads on to this idea that also what matters to pain is not just these kinds of bodily underpinnings, it's also something to do with the mental state. Pain is a feeling. So there's probably, from my point of view, no single definition we can give of pain that's going to absolutely respect both of those bodily and mental elements. So we need to think of pain as a complex kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Just the idea of pain, it's such a huge subject that we spend so long thinking about how to avoid pain, how to deal with pain. It's something that's, in terms of that big philosophical question, it's a pretty big one. We will return back to talking about psychological pain and physical pain. But I thought it would also be good at this stage just to talk to you a bit about one area that we know that your specialism is in terms of chronic pain. And just wanted to ask you in terms of that, as a type of pain, how does that differ from other types of pain?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think when most people start thinking about pain or talking about pain, they have in mind what we call acute pain. So that's the kind of pain that you get when you put your hand on a hot surface and you immediately pull it away because you have a burning sensation, or the kind of pain you get when you cut your finger with a knife. It's an immediate response to physical damage, to damage to some part of the body. But that kind of acute pain, even though it provides our main model for thinking about pain, it really only scratches the surface of the kinds of pain that there are. And alongside that, we have this notion of chronic pain. So chronic pain is pain that goes on for an extended period and which doesn't seem to correlate well with bodily injury. So you might develop chronic pain after having surgery. There's quite a large population that after surgery to correct an issue actually have ongoing continuous pain even once everything's healed from the surgery. You might develop chronic pain through injury. So lower back pain is an incredibly well recognized problem in the UK. It creates a lot of issues to do with attendance at work and ability, to live your life the way you want to. It doesn't seem to be easily treated by things like surgery to address problems in the spine. So it seems to be a kind of dissociation between injury and the pain. And there are conditions which just seem to lead to this kind of non-localized pain. So perhaps the best known of them is fibromyalgia, which is a condition that leads to a sort of general sense of pain that can move around the body, and again, which doesn't seem tied to any particular physical injury. And I think chronic pain is really interesting because it doesn't have this direct link to physical injury. It really pushes us to think about how we understand that notion of pain and how we understand the relation to the body. And it pushes us to think about the mental aspects to pain, but to think about them in a way that doesn't kind of undermine or undervalue a patient's experience. So if you think about the way we use language, we sometimes talk about pain as being, all in the mind, meaning that it doesn't have this clear connection to the body. But by saying that, we also seem to be suggesting that it's in some way not real, or that the patient's experience, isn't as valid as the experience of someone who's just cut their finger or stubbed their toe. So part of my research has really been trying to think about what it means to say that there's a strong psychological component to chronic pain in such a way that you're not saying that the patients are in any way making it up. You're not saying that it's any way their fault that they're in pain. But what you are saying is that there might be ways to address their pain that aren't simply kind of physical interventions. There may be no surgery that someone who's suffering from chronic pain can undergo that will help them. There may be no pill that someone with fibromyalgia can take that will get rid of their pain. But there may be psychological mechanisms that we can employ that will help them to live with the pain and help them to ameliorate it in some way. And so that's the kind of question that I've been thinking about in my research. How do we help people with that kind of pain?
I think that's really fascinating, because I certainly think of pain in terms of, certain milestones might involve pain, loss of a loved one, or you run a marathon, and it's always something you think of as, we need to get through this pain for a greater goal, or just with time it will go away. So chronic pain is something, it is quite scary actually to think of how you can just have pain, constantly, and how that would actually change your outlook on life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, actually, that brings it back to something that you said a little while ago. You said, we always try and avoid pain. And I thought at that point, that's not exactly right. Sometimes we don't try and avoid pain. So the example of the marathon runner is a really good case in point. They will get to the wall and they will fight through it because they think that there's some kind of greater good to be had by going through that pain. And in fact, you can see the same thing in experimental settings, which is, the way that we're thinking about our pain will influence how we feel it and how we experience it and how livable with we find it. So you can do these really nice experiments where you get someone into the lab and you're going to give them some kind of heat shock, some kind of thermal stimuli on their arm, which is going to just cross their pain threshold. And you say to someone, I'm going to do this now, but you can choose whether I do it or not. If you let me do it, I'll give you a quid. If you don't let me do it, that's fine. We'll just go home. And if you do that to one set of people where you give them the choice and one set of people where you haven't given them any choice, and you apply exactly the same kind of stimuli, exactly the same level of kind of ingress to them, you will find that the people who chose the pain rate it as far less painful than the people who didn't choose it. So just the mere fact that you feel like you had a bit of an option about whether you went through it or not can really massively change the way that you experience it. And I think we can take those kinds of lessons into our understanding of chronic pain, that, thinking about the purpose of the pain, the context of the pain, the meaning of the pain for the individual, all of those things are going to be factors which influence how someone experiences the pain and how they find ways to live with it.
That is fascinating. I must admit, I hadn't really kind of thought about it in that detail, or thought about the fact that if you try and anticipate it, and if there's a kind of motivation, that might actually tone the pain down. So somewhat, I'm just kind of quite interested. Is there a country, in your opinion, Emma, which has dealt with this well, or where there is good conversations around the kind of mental pain? Is there a model of good example?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think I know of a country that does it well. I mean, there are definitely pockets of really good practice, and I might point very close to home. So part of my research, I work with Royal Berkshire Hospital with clinicians and other staff who work in the pain management unit, and that's a multidisciplinary unit where they're working really hard to help chronic pain patients who have come to the end of treatment with other lines of the NHS to find ways forward. And they do a really good job of, helping people to think about the way that they're thinking about pain and have these kinds of conversations that might help people. So the project I've been working on with them is really thinking about, maybe there are these two very different ways of thinking about pain. One really focuses on the kind of bodily features. So when you say, I've got a pain in my ankle, and it really is something in the body, it's in the ankle and it's caused by whatever's gone wrong in your ankle. That's one way of thinking about pain. And then there's this other way where we're much more focused on the way it feels and the way that it affects our experience. And if you're thinking about pain in that really bodily way, then it seems clear that the only way to help relieve that pain is going to be some kind of physical intervention, some kind of surgery, some kind of drug. But with chronic pain, we know that doesn't work, right? If we look at the US in particular, if you think about the epidemic of opioid misuse that you have in the US, that's all come from ascribing really powerful opioid painkillers to conditions that weren't going to be helped by that kind of treatment. So we think that if you think about pain in a bodily way, you're likely to think that what you need is an opioid or a surgery or something like that. But if you can lead people into concentrating more on this kind of mental aspect of pain, then it becomes more obvious or more clear what the pathway would be from having some treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy or mindfulness, and how that might help to influence the experience of pain that you're having. So that's the work we're doing with them. And I think that's a really nice example of the way in which something as complex as pain requires a really complex team. We've got clinicians, academic researchers, including philosophers and psychologists. We've got physiotherapists, clinical psychologists, a really broad range of expertise coming together to try and address the real problems that patients face in their lives.
We're going to move on now to another side of your research, Emma, moving from pain onto business ethics. And I think me and Chris sort of frame this in terms of, do businesses have empathy for the pain of others or the needs of their employees? Perhaps that's best just for you to introduce that.
Yeah. I mean, well done for trying to bridge the gap between the two of them. They're definitely quite disparate fields of research. I mean, I do think there is a way in which they come together a bit, because there's a sort of broader question that I've been interested in philosophy for some time about what it is to perform an intentional action, what philosophers call an intentional action versus an unintentional action. So, this is a distinction that's familiar to everybody. We're not in the same room, but if we were in the same room, if I was to lean forward and stamp on Chris's toe, that would be an intentional action, and I would be held responsible for what I'd done. I would have to explain myself. I'm sorry, Chris, there was a spider on your foot and I thought I should get rid of it. Or I would have to apologize, very sorry, don't know what came over me. On the other hand, if we're in the same room and Phil reaches over and kind of grabs my foot and uses my foot to stamp on Chris's toe, that's not an intentional action. I'm not responsible for what happened there. Phil's going to have to explain himself to you, Chris, and tell you why he's behaving in this this rather odd fashion. So I've been interested in what the difference is between what it is to perform an intentional action. How do we account for that in philosophy? And it seems to have something to do with performing an action for a reason. You know, I'm performing the action because I think it's going to promote the things that I want or lead to an outcome that I desire. And in pain, that becomes a kind of attenuated relationship, because a lot of the processing to do with pain is going to be unconscious, what philosophers and psychologists call subpersonal. So how is it that we're responding to information that we may not even be consciously aware of? That becomes a very interesting question around pain. But then it also extends out, because we talk about things that aren't people as things that can perform intentional actions. So in fact, businesses are a really classic case in point. We will talk about businesses as doing things intentionally or unintentionally. You know, this company intentionally harmed the environment versus this company had an unintentional bad impact on its environment. And, you know, to pick up an example that's recently been in the press, just yesterday and the day before, there's been a lot of coverage of Amazon destroying products that were perfectly saleable just because they weren't selling. And you could see this being said, you know, Amazon intentionally destroys saleable items. And then there's a real question about, well, what is it for a company to do something intentionally? You know, is it that Jeff Bezos had this intention? That doesn't seem quite right. So there's a question about how we explain what it is for businesses to do things intentionally. And that leads on to this question about what the purpose of a business is. How does it have a purpose, and how does it realize that purpose? There's been a kind of view most commonly associated with the economist Milton Friedman, although whether or not this is exactly his position is probably something for debate. But there's this kind of Friedman-esque position which holds that private sector companies, their only purpose is to create profit. So as long as they're not doing anything illegal, what they have to do is kind of maximize the return for shareholders. And that leads to a view of business as doing whatever it wants as long as it's maximizing profit. And you might think that it's that kind of perspective on the purpose of a business that's got us into the situation that we are now, a situation where we've had things like the events around the financial crisis of 2007 to 8, you know, various kind of climate scandals, various kind of data sharing problems. You know, we seem to be in a position where the behavior of business is not as we would want it to be. And the suggestion I've tried to pursue in my research on business ethics is that we need to redefine the purpose of business in light of sort of a philosophical understanding of the relationship between organizations and the state and individuals.
Just as a follow-up question, so one person I always found quite interesting was Reagan. And Reagan, in some ways, was very much, if you want, influenced by free market thinkers. And when he was explaining his arguments for the free market, you know, many of which were taken on by people such as Thatcher, the idea seemed to be that if you give if you want businesses, if you give banks almost extremely high levels of liberty, they will return profits and they will learn to regulate themselves, and they will do significant good by doing that. Is that essentially something which we now know is a mistake in thinking? If you give that much power and influence to the free market, invariably, surely then problems will follow, because not every human being is going to act ethically, and most businesses are surely not going to act ethically if there isn't proper regulation. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I think I would say that is a fair statement. I'm not someone who thinks that capitalism is in and of itself a mistake. You know, I do think that humans are incredibly inventive, and the way to harness human invention is to allow people to create things that are going to improve lives for society in general, but also for themselves. You know, they should be allowed to make a legitimate profit out of the things that they're doing that will improve the lives of themselves and their loved ones, because that is the way that people will really, you know, work hard for the things they want to achieve. And also that capitalism does, you know, it has a range of benefits that it brings to society that are kind of unarguable. You know, we do want jobs, we do want companies that pay tax. All of those kinds of things are good for society. Business has been a kind of civilizing force for societies. There's a philosophical idea called do commerce, which is this idea that business essentially does good. And I do think that's right. I do think business does essentially do good. But as you say, only within certain kinds of constraints. I think what we need to recognize is that the idea that businesses can just regulate themselves is fundamentally problematic for the reasons you gave, and also because it doesn't create a level playing field for businesses. If you're trying to operate and you're trying to do things properly, but the company next door is busy cutting corners and, pouring their effluent into the river and doing whatever else they need to do to make a profit, it's going to be impossible for the good company to make a profit. So I actually think the business itself should want sufficient regulation to create a level playing field where everyone has to meet a kind of standard. But on the other hand, something I've also argued in my research is that there's a problem with just thinking that the answer here is regulation. So you might think, look, what we'll do is we'll just create rules, and the rules will tell companies how they have to behave, and then life will be fine. But actually, it's very hard to do that, because these questions are questions of ethical behavior, and it's very hard to regulate for ethical behavior. What regulation does is set a kind of lowest minimum standard that everybody has to meet. But what we really need to be asking firms to do now is something much more aspirational. We have to be asking them to act for the social good. And that's the kind of thing that you don't really get just from kind of straightforward regulation, I think.
So does that go back to what you were saying about purpose? Various people have said that you can compare some corporations to psychopaths if it was a human being, because there's no empathy or guilt or remorse, and if their purpose is just to make money, then things that are damaging will come out of that. And is that what you're saying? That's how we need to reprogram things?
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly right, that I think we need to get businesses to think harder about what their purpose is. Is it just to make money, or is it to make money in a way that leaves a sustainable world for their children and their children's children, and that contributes in some way to human flourishing? And I think it's clear, business people they're not radically different to other people, right? They don't park their morals by the door when they go into work, we hope. So I think what we need to do is find a language for them and a framing for them that just makes clear what their choices are here. So there used to be this idea that what you needed in business was the kind of day-to-day operations of the business, and then this notion of corporate social responsibility that sat at the end of the corridor and made everything okay. So, when I started thinking about this a lot, it was around the time of the financial crisis. And some of the banks that I and my colleagues went and spoke to, some of the banks that had done some of the worst things during the financial crisis had the biggest CSR departments of any. They were busy handing out money to charities left, right and centre. And somehow that was supposed to make it okay that they'd engaged in, these really kind of casino banking type practices. So I think what I've tried to argue for is that CSR isn't quite the right way to go. We really do need this kind of integrated notion of purpose, where you think about, well, why does my organization exist? What am I trying to get it to do? And that will influence the day-to-day behavior of hopefully everybody in the organization, and stop instances we have where the behavior of firms has really come apart from what we as a society need it to be.
I think you're certainly right. I mean, I think when you're speaking about behavior and responsibility, I guess you could say the world in which we live in is a two-way street between the companies and also with consumer. Do we as consumers have to take some responsibility in the purpose of our purchases? So maybe not just I don't want to pull up Amazon unnecessarily here, but for example, it's incredible you can have deliveries which arrive at your doorstep so quickly. But rather than just thinking from a consumer, I'm going to use that service because it's the quickest, most efficient way of me getting that product, do we also have to have that kind of ethical purpose in our own decision making as consumers as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think there are two really important points that you're raising there. So maybe just to return to the first one, and then to talk about consumer activism. So on the first one, this idea of a two-way street, I think that's exactly right. So what I've tried to argue is that there's a really well-known philosophical concept called the social contract. And when that was developed by philosophers like, Hobbes and Rousseau and people, they were really interested in the relationship between the individual and the state, and the idea that an individual might give up some of the liberties that they were entitled to in order to have greater protection from the state. So, I would give up my right to come and stamp on Chris's toe in order to live in a society where other people don't come and stamp on my toes, So that was the initial idea of a social contract, that individuals gave up liberties to have the protection of the state. But I've argued that we really need to think about the social contract as applying to organisations as well, to private sector organisations. So they get a lot of benefits from operating in the societies that they do. They get a well-educated workforce, they get good transport systems, they get protection under the law. All these kinds of things are genuine goods to the company that they get from society, and that instills a kind of demand on a business that it does good for society in return. So I think that's why societies have a right to demand that their businesses don't go around exploiting them, because they've already provided all of these goods. That creates a debt on the side of the business. So that is absolutely to stress this kind of two-way street idea that you mentioned. But then the second point you raised is this question of consumer activism. And I think you're absolutely right that this can't be something where we just leave it all to the state and think that's fine. We absolutely have to be thinking really hard about ourselves as players in this game, and as individuals that can have an influence on the way that things progress here. But on the other hand, these are very complicated issues, and consumers just don't have either the time or the information as things stand to really make informed choices. If I'm wondering about whether I should be a good vegan and have this tofu based meal, or have some locally sourced mutton, which is the better and the greener choice there? I don't know the answer to that question. If the tofu has had to be flown in from, somewhere else, then it might be better to eat the very old sheep from the field down the road. So these are very complicated things, and they're things that people often don't have time to research carefully enough in order to make really informed decisions. So part of what I've argued for actually is that we really need the state to step in and to create some sort of clear, easy to recognise metrics that we can use to assess companies, and that companies should have to report on how they're living up to these metrics. And so that even if I don't do the work for each individual kind of product, I could look to a company and I could say, there is a company that my state is telling me is a good company. I should purchase from that over the slightly cheaper company down the road. And I think that would be a really useful thing. And it would also show to companies why this was a good thing for them to be doing, right? Because I think there is a good business case to be made for companies to be greener and more ethical and just generally better. But we as consumers need to hold up our side of the bargain, right? We need to put our money where our mouth is and say it matters to us that this company is being greener and more ethical and better.
And that sounds like a great idea, but there's also that need for it to be not bulletproof. But I think we've become quite cynical now around that businesses can do a lot to make it seem like they're ethical, and with their corporate social responsibility programs, and do everything so on the facade it looks correct, but actually under the surface it isn't. So a system where you actually get to the truth of the matter would be fantastic. And that kind of leads us to our last big question around, do you think the commercial world is becoming more ethical in general? I mean, because there's a lot of talk nowadays about companies woke washing, doing posts on social media that kind of tick the right boxes and say the right things, but actually their actions don't back that up at all.
I do think things are changing. I'm generally quite an optimistic person, and when I started this research, early 2000s, you didn't find such an open door. You didn't find people who were as interested in these questions. Now, when I go and talk to businesses, many of them have done a lot of work and have thought really, really hard about how they make themselves more ethical, how they perform better against these kinds of metrics. And I think on a global scale, there is really positive leadership to some of our really big multinational companies now, which really are trying to make a change. I also think that the idea that we might be able to introduce an agreed global minimum tax charge for multinational companies. That has to be a good thing. These have to be transnational solutions. It's not the case that just a single state will be able to solve the problems here. So I do think there's genuine progress both in business and in the state and amongst consumers. And in some ways, I think, the pandemic, as appalling as it has been, has helped people see that, the world can't be taken for granted and our actions do have an effect, and maybe we do need to think more long term about the decisions we're making. So I'm optimistic. I also do think that greenwashing and woke-washing are genuine issues, and that's why we need the state to step in. Individuals can't be responsible for finding out where a company is telling you that it's behaving well, that it really is behaving well. That has to be the responsibility of the state. So when you talk to government and they think they can leave it up to businesses, then that worries me for precisely this kind of reason. I think there's a clear role for the state in protecting individuals from those companies that think they can engage in sort of greenwashing.
Fantastic. That seems like a positive and wise point to end it on. I don't know, Phil, if you've got any more questions.
No, I think we've covered so much, and I think Emma, you're involved with so many massive things from society. Your brain must be constantly buzzing with big questions.
But it's good, it's a good way to live. It's nice to get the chance to think about these things. So
fantastic. And I can confirm to the audience my toe is alive and well. Survived all the examples.
Yeah, we're only ever thought experiments in philosophy. We never really have to stamp on anybody. So
all right, well, perfect. Just remains to say, Emma, thank you so much for joining us. That was a brilliant episode. Really fascinating stuff. And you're always welcome back on the show.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking to you.
That was an absorbing interview with Emma, delivering some much needed wisdom and apt advice. Next up, we have Dina Rezik, a lecturer in Middle Eastern history and an expert on that region. Please do join us again for what promises to be another intriguing episode. Goodbye.